Hello pandas. We've covered nearly every type of common metal you can get a price on as a scrapper, except this one, and it's a good one. Stainless steel. What a fantastic material to recycle. Due to some of its properties, it's more common than you might think. It's got good weight, and it usually comes in really large pieces. I've learned more about it than I thought there was to know in my time scrapping metal for money, because there are many different types, and with very different prices. So if you're recycling metal, whether you just started or you've been at it for a while, here is everything you need to know about stainless steel. What it is, how to tell the difference between series, and what it's worth. First off, let's get up to speed on what exactly it is, because in my mind, it's pretty crazy stuff. In fairness, I'm a bit of a metallurgical nerd, but still. So it's an alloy metal, just like brass or solder or regular steel, meaning a mixture of a bunch of different metals together. Now, there are lots of applications where a material that doesn't corrode or rust is required, but brass and copper are just too soft. You need strength too. At some point 100 or so years ago, we learned that if you alloy steel with at least 10.5% chromium, the chrome will create a thin oxide layer on the surface and the material doesn't rust anymore. Chromium isn't cheap though, which is part of the reason why stainless steel is worth so much more than regular steel. That, and it's fully recyclable. Around 60% of the stainless steel in the world today is made out of recycled materials. But the addition of chromium is just the beginning of the story. Now stay with me here, because in order to go any further, we need to consider the atomic structure. Now, I'm not a science-osopher, so this will just be a super rough simplification. No quantum mechanics. So, when metals solidify, they form crystalline structures at the atomic level, and those structures can vary depending on conditions. Iron can have one of two different crystal structures, body-centered cubic and face-centered cubic. Shut up, hexagonal close packed! Two structures. I actually made some Play-Doh earlier to try and demonstrate this, but it turns out Play-Doh is not much of a modeling material. So, like and subscribe. Now, iron will shift from body-centered cubic to face-centered cubic when heated up, and then back down again once it cools. Now, body-centered cubic is a great crystal structure, don't get me wrong, we've used it to great success for 5,000 years, but it has its shortcomings. Primarily, it's really brittle. That's basically because face-centered cubic has many more cracks and spaces, so that allows things to shift and move, which gives it much more ductility. You can also fit a lot more carbon atoms into those little cracks if you wanted to add carbon to harden it. Now that is a hyper-simplification, but that's what I'm aiming for, a simplified version. This video doesn't need to be... Well, what an exciting day it must have been when we discovered that if you add some nickel to the stainless steel, it creates some quantum magical scaffolding that stabilizes it in its face-centered cubic state, even at much lower temperatures. So, now we have a room temperature stable, face-centered cubic crystal iron, alloyed with chromium for corrosion resistance. Its higher ductility makes it much tougher even at extremely low temperatures, and it has even further corrosion resistance because of the addition of the nickel. Nickel is also kind of expensive, so the value of the material is increased again, but the added versatility makes it worth it, and as a result, around 70% of all the stainless steel in the world contains nickel. So that's it? Two types? No. But that's just the most basic way to look at it. The truth is, there are countless different types of stainless steel available because this recipe is customizable depending on your specific needs. And those two crystal structures we talked about, they are a much, much bigger deal than I'm making them sound right now. In fact, the differences between them are sort of the basis for all of the cool stuff that we do with iron and steel, which is a pretty important material in modern society. See, those crystal structures respond differently to work hardening and welding and being asked to hold carbon atoms, and can be controlled to appear in different distributions and different percentages. So, as a scrapper, how are you to know what bin it goes in? Well, you have to accept that the only way to truly know what series it is with an XRF analyzer, which you probably can't afford and most scrapyards don't have. But the most common, by a long shot, is stainless steel 304, or 18-8. This has about 18% chromium and 8% nickel, more or less. You'll find it in everything from cutlery to home appliance facing, and it's worth about 40 to 50 cents a pound. The really good stuff is stainless steel 316 because it has about twice as much nickel in it and a small percentage of molybdenum. So it's much more corrosion resistant and is considered marine grade. It's found on chemical equipment, body jewelry, and saltwater equipment. Obviously. It's worth about 80 cents a pound as scrap. Your scrapyard might be reluctant to accept something as 316 though, unless you can prove it. And I think that's because refineries melt it down into new 316 products, so they want to keep the melt pure. That's why it's worth more and will sometimes be stamped as 316 for that reason. So, how did we end up nerding out about crystal structures when we're just here to sell some scrap? Well, that's the reason why the magnet test is a myth when it comes to comparing stainless steel to traditional steels. And that part would get into quantum mechanics. Basically, body-centered cubic stainless, known as ferritic stainless, will attract a magnet because it has unpaired electrons floating about which will respond to a magnetic field. Whereas austenitic stainless, the face-centered cubic one, has all of its electrons paired up and canceling each other out, so it will not. However, if you bend a piece of austenitic stainless, some of the crystals will revert back to ferritic and become magnetic. And we should also be aware that nickel itself is slightly magnetic and will create a gentle pull on a magnet. The piece could also be a blend of austenitic and ferritic, or martensitic. The point being, using a magnet to determine if a piece of steel is stainless is a deeply flawed method, but for a scrapper it's still useful, if a bit incomplete information. If a magnet doesn't stick, it's probably 300 series, and you can put it in a bin and call it 304, because it usually is. If it has a minor amount of rust, but it's been functioning somewhere it probably should have more, or it has a slight pull on a magnet, but not nearly as much as traditional mild steel, well, it's probably one of the other less valuable grades. Something like stainless steel 201, which has almost no nickel, or the 400 series, which is the ferritic stuff. If it has a gentle pull, but it's in stunning condition with a beautiful finish, it might be 316, and you should set it aside because it's worth twice as much, depending on where the value of nickel is sitting at the time. The spark test can be useful. Now the spark test is another limited but useful test. See, this piece of stainless steel here, I know it's stainless steel because it would have some rust all around under these edges because it's a water dish, but it's a little magnetic. It's actually fairly magnetic, but it doesn't just snap right on there like it would with your typical piece of mild steel. So when we put the grinder up to it, the higher amount of nickel in 316 would cause the sparks to be shorter and duller. But they're not. So I'm going to put this in my 304 bin. It could be 201, but I think it's more likely that the crystal structure became ferritic through being cold formed into this shape. I know that just seems more complicated, but it should help explain why so many people, including scrapyards, have such a hard time telling stainless steel apart. You may want to look around and find one that is familiar with the stuff and can test it properly, because it can be really profitable and adds up quickly. I hope this has been useful. I left a lot out, which is a shame, but my goal was to help the scrappers. So if you're a scrapper and you want to help, then click the like button and subscribe for more scrap tips and guides. Leave it better than you found it. Keep doing the thing.